For this weekend's shipwreck video, we'll be doing the first of two shipwrecks for Pearl Harbor week. Why two? Well, because this year, Pearl Harbor Day happens to fall on a Sunday. It seemed fitting as a result to do a double feature of Pearl wrecks on either end of the week. But I digress. To kick things off, we'll be starting on the Japanese side of the shipwrecks. More specifically, the midget submarines that were involved in the attack. 5 of these were sent in to try and infiltrate the harbor, with one of them, the one sunk by USS Ward, a wreck I've already covered. The link will be in the description if you are interested. So, what about the other 4 then? Well, we'll get to that in a moment. First, let's set the stage. The air attack on Pearl Harbor is, of course, very well known. The subject of movies of varying quality and documentaries galore. One of the most infamous days in American history, and one that will never be forgotten. However, the air attack was only one portion of the Japanese battle plan. Beneath the waves off Hawaii, the other part was put into action. This saw 5 fleet submarines loaded up with one Type A midget sub each. Those boats would set up off the harbor on December 6th, no more than 10 nautical miles, 19 kilometers from the entrance, where each of the mother subs would let their midget submarine go to infiltrate Pearl Harbor from beneath the waves. As the plan went, those would launch around 1 a.m. on December 7th. Each of the 5 submarines would then proceed individually into the harbor, where their 2-man crew would wait for the right moment to fire off their pair of torpedoes. While not ostensibly a suicide mission, I doubt that those 10 men really thought they'd be coming back. For today, I'll focus on one of those boats. As noted, I previously covered the one found and sunk by USS Ward. Another would run aground where a crewman, Kazuo Sakamaki, became the first Japanese POW of the war. A third entered the harbor where it was run down by USS Monaghan, while the fourth would scuttle outside the harbor only to be raised in the 1960s and return to Japan. The 5th boat is the curious one, the mystery boat number 16, I-16 Tow. What about this boat? Well, number 16 remains something of a question mark. Campaigns of the Pacific War cites the Japanese receiving a message around 1241 on December 8th, supposedly from number 16, citing damage to a large warship. 2 other messages would also go through. First at 10:41 p.m. on December 7th, describing the successful air attack, and then a final message around 12:51 a.m. on December 8th that was simply unable to navigate. Now, did this boat actually hit her targets? Well, that depends on which target you think she was firing on. Battleship Row or USS St. Louis leaving the harbor. There's some who argue, yes, this midget submarine hit at least Oklahoma. There's others who argue, no, there's no conclusive evidence of this. It's one of the great unsolved mysteries of that day, not least because we don't know exactly what happened to this boat or her crew. As it is, there's 2 theories for the sinking. The first, related to the attack theory, is a scuttling in West Lock, based mostly on damage to the wreck and the location of her wreckage when it was first sighted in 1992. The 3 pieces, which were found in different surveys, were mixed in with American debris, specifically debris from the Westlock disaster. Thus, you have the theory that the boat was scuttled in that area, where the Navy discovered it as they picked up the pieces of the disaster, only to keep the discovery secret, likely for morale purposes, at which point they dumped the wreck of the sub with the rest of the disaster debris. An alternative theory, meanwhile, posits that the boat never actually made it into the harbor at all, that she was spotted by USS Condor and forced to linger outside the harbor, where the boat would fire on USS St. Louis, leaving Pearl Harbor, which missed, forcing the sub to dive and evade attack. The reports from St. Louis are common to multiple members of the crew, though the exact details do vary on who you ask. Either way, the boat would remain submerged until running out of power, at which point she surfaced and sent off those messages, before scuttling charges sent the sub to the bottom, where the wreck would be located outside Pearl Harbor in 1951. The Navy kept the discovery quiet, cut the boat into pieces, and dumped her in the Westlock debris field. This is, incidentally, the explanation given in the NOAA dive, primarily based on a letter from 1956 indicating a salvage in 1951. And in both of the explanations, no crew remains were found. That said, we've wrapped up the background now, so as such, it's time to get into the wreck section, which will focus on number 16. There's not a lot to touch on with the others, really. There's all of 2 surviving pictures of number 22 that I'm aware of. Number 18 was brought from the bottom, restored, and put on display with a reproduction bow in Japan, specifically in Etajima. Number 19, Sakamaki's boat, is self-explanatory. It was restored and put on display, eventually ending up at the Museum of the Pacific War in Fredericksburg, Texas. And again, I've covered the Ward boat. So that leaves number 16. We'll be looking at 2 things here in this regard. A survey by the Hawaii Undersea Research Laboratory in 2009, and a more recent look by NOAA in 2016. I'll note that I'm not sure what depth this was located at. If it's roughly the depth of Ward's sub, that's 1,200 feet or 366 meters. I am not sure, however. That aside, I should also note that even the 2009 survey is a fair bit later than the initial discovery. The 3 pieces were found in order in 1992, 2000, and 2001. I'll link articles showing a couple shots from those earlier surveys, but I'll focus on 2009 today. Bearing all that in mind, let's start with the obvious question. Why exactly is this submarine in 3 pieces? Well, that is actually easy to answer. It's because those submarines were designed and built in 3 pieces. 3 easy to disassemble chunks for transportation purposes. So this boat being in pieces is not really surprising, like it would be for a larger submarine. You see that on the stern where there's a neat ending. Not so much on the midship section where there's a large bit destroyed by an internal explosion. The bow, meanwhile, shows a clear cut on the joint. This was likely cut off when the boat was salvaged, though no equipment seems to have been removed during this. Most likely the Navy saw no need to do so, regardless of when she was found in 1944 or 1951. That said, let's move on to the bow now, with its famous figure 8 torpedo guard, a distinctive feature of these wrecks, and something that is, unlike the Ward boat, still in place as of 2016. Here we see it in 2009. This is an excellent look from the bow showing the aforementioned guard, which is rusty and covered in coral, but otherwise perfectly preserved. No real damage, and certainly no rusting away. This wasn't exactly thick metal, so I'm honestly a bit impressed by this. In any case, behind that guard, we can see the empty torpedo tubes. These submarines were basically built around the two tubes, one over the other. On the Ward boat, we can see the torpedoes still in place. She never had a chance to fire. On this sub, however, both are clearly missing, and the lack of damage to the tubes tells us those were fired. They weren't removed or fell out. In either case, there would be visible damage to the hull, even if only from further rusting. Instead, well, it's just the empty holes. Regardless of what target you think she fired on, the battleships or St. Louis, it's clear that she did fire. Regardless, as we continue on, we have a lower angle shot, looking up towards one of the research lab's submersibles, looking down on the submarine's bow, which does two things. Give us a look at where it broke back here, and a good demonstration of the size of the midget boats. You can see the comparison between the bow section here and the submersible above it. For reference, these boats were 24 meters, 78 feet long, with a beam of 1.8 meters, just under 6 feet, and they displaced about 47 tons when submerged. Big they were not, though still larger than a modern submersible. The next two pictures, meanwhile, show much the same, but from different angles. The second one gives a better look at the wreck, which formed a divot in the sand, leaving it partially buried, though none of the important details are hidden. The third picture, meanwhile, shows the submersible moving a bit further down, towards the break where the submarine was disassembled. We'll get to that in a moment. Before then, we'll wrap up the bow. Here we've got an excellent side profile shot, which shows, among other things, this piece of metal between the tubes, as well as how the guard comes to an angle at the front. An angle that is also visible here from ahead of the wreck, along with a slight list the bow ended up with when it hit the bottom. Meanwhile, the next two images are both from dead ahead. The first one here from a bit higher up. It lets us look inside the empty tubes, though there's not much to note there. Just silt where the torpedoes used to be. The second shot for its part is from lower down. Again, there's not a lot here. We can see better how much mud has gone inside. But, well, it's just empty torpedo tubes. The guard is the really interesting bit, and we've touched on this already. For the moment, let's wrap up the forward end of the bow here. A more distant side shot, which serves mostly to give a look at the entire bow section. And again, how buried it is from this angle. That brings us to the end of the forward section for 2009. Now for the other end. First, this upper level look here, where we can see clear damage on the top, along with the remnants of a chain poking out. This is likely where the Navy cut into the boat to carry the bow, though there's less remaining here compared to the amidships section. From the other side of the wreck, there's no sign of that damage at all, other than the bit poking out of the top anyway. That portion is basically undamaged aside from the ravages of time. Something that can't be said when you move a bit further along. With this image from the disassembled area looking towards the bow. We've got that damaged bit here, though it's mostly out of frame. We also have the clean cut here. Remember on the Ward video how her wreck was splitting apart in 2016? That was this joint coming loose. On this one, well, we can see inside. We have it from a distance here, showing how neat the disassembly was, along with equipment taking up basically the entire bow. It's not clear from this distance, but it is from closer in. This is what's left of the torpedo tubes and associated gear. The upper tube is cracked open, and the support equipment is a mess of debris. However, the bottom tube beneath the rust is seemingly intact. Even the valve is still in place. Between the two, this image shows just how cramped the bow was. Ahead of the joint, it was basically the torpedo tubes and nothing else. The Undersea Research Lab website includes a look at a more intact boat, which further demonstrates how cramped it was, but also how much has fallen away on this one. Either way, though, that wraps up the 2009 look. Now a brief detour to 2016 before we move to the midship section. We'll begin here from the torpedo tubes. Those have fallen apart even more in the intervening years. It's not as apparent from further out. However, moving closer in, well, that shows the damage better. The upper tube is pretty much gone. There's a massive chunk missing, and what remains is rusting through. Very apparent here from a zoomed-in shot. And the lower tube is little better. It started to rust through as well, particularly around the valve. There's very little steel left around there, and I'm half surprised that it hasn't fallen off. It probably has by this point, almost a decade later. Though without another survey, I can't say for sure. In any event, the other equipment varies. There's a lot of rusted out and unrecognizable debris. Yet especially here, there's also intact piping. Even some very small and slender pipes are still there. Goes to show how deterioration can and will vary. Something that equally applies to where the boat was cut up. The bolts we saw on Ward are gone here. How much of that is the bolts were cut in the salvage is the open question. They almost certainly were. But it's tough to say if they were completely ground down or if they've rusted away in the decades since, be it from 1944 or 1951. No matter which it is, let's move on to the salvage chain, which is actually a bit interesting. On most areas of this wreck, the rust damage has increased a lot between the surveys. On this part, it actually hasn't. Not by much. The hole is a bit bigger, but it's not a massive change. That's a bit of a surprise. Generally, damaged steel rusts faster. You can even see that on this wreck. But here, it's an interesting deviation from the norm. Though we do at least get better angles, so there's that. And on the subject of better angles and rust damage, we have the tip of the bow. This side, which we didn't see in the 2009 images. That's unfortunate because we've got a large rust hole by the tubes. It's something NOAA put a good bit of focus on. The large hole here and two smaller holes nearby. It's very clearly some sort of damage that's rusted out over the years. But it's difficult to say what this damage was. or how bad it was in 2009. Regardless, in 2016, it gave a good look inside the tubes, from a different angle, though again, there's just silt and rust on the interior. As for the rest of the bow, well, we have this look at the guard, which doesn't seem to have changed at all. I know I've banged on about this, but on the Ward boat, that completely fell apart. On this one, however, it really is much the same. I can't pick out any major changes, no matter which angle you look at it from. I suppose the one on Ward's boat might have been damaged by impact with the bottom, or the depth charges. But this one, which seems undamaged, has held up much better, from the side, from the front, or even from the other side, which is something that equally applies to this side of the submarine. While the hull is certainly overgrown, there's no apparent rust holes. Not of any note, anyway. All of the damage seems to be concentrated on the other side of the boat. So, with that in mind, let's wrap this section up with a view from above, as Noah's survey ascended, staring down on the ruined bow, which is, as it turns out, the most intact of the submarine sections. The amidships portion is nowhere near so well preserved. There's a lot more damage here. That's apparent even when you start from the side angle here, where the aft end is a mess of debris, complete with broken steel where the scuttling charge went off, while the conning tower ahead of it is covered in rust. The periscope, which was intact and extended in the first survey, broke off, leaving a stump behind. And faintly visible further to the bow, we have the chain used to salvage that section, something we can see from further away, along with the gaping hole where the bow section used to be. We'll see that better lit later on. For the moment, let's turn to a side angle. This one is mostly notable for the hole here. That was not damage from battle or salvage. It is apparently from a camera sled colliding with the wreck by accident. An unfortunate bit of damage, though it did open up a look inside. Evidently, there was a 2014 survey that sent a camera inside, where it found, among other things, an extra air cylinder. Unfortunately, I haven't found that survey yet, if it was ever made public at all. We see that hole better here, and again here, along with the forward battery compartment, which is much nicer here than it will be in 2016. Even so, there's a lot of debris that fell forward. The batteries themselves, which fell from their racks and crashed into the front of the compartment, resulting in a mess of debris here, clogging up the interior doorway full of ruined batteries, though the rest of the interior bulkhead is still visible, behind the salvage chain, which has fallen away and towards the bottom, something we see better here from further out, as well as from above, also showing the conning tower. We also see the chain from the side here. This was when the research lab took a sample of the growth on the wreck. That's the reason for the sediment flying away. We see that sample in the next couple images. This is something to keep in mind when we return for 2016. The same applies to the chain and its hole seen close in here. However, before we move to 2016, let's zoom back out. First for a side shot here, showing the chain and the conning tower, though the latter is pretty dark. Then even further out from the bow here, mostly good for giving a look at the profile of the submarine. It also wraps up the forward section for the moment. Let's turn to the aft portion of the midship section. This area is far more damaged. As I said, the crew scuttled their boat. The massive damage here is consistent in both shape and location with the scuttling charge, and in particular with an internal explosion, leaving a jagged hole in the boat just behind the conning tower. That damage has, of course, provided an excellent look inside the boat. We can see it better from the side here, where the metal has torn away, leaving the scattered remnants of the aft batteries, along with a good bit of loose wiring as well. When looking from dead astern, that wiring is easier to see, reaching back into what's left of the interior. We see that interior from the side here, although there's not much to really note. The wiring, yes, as well as the internal ribbing of the hull, but the rest is either gone or covered in mud. Much the same applies from astern, though we can at least see the forward end of the compartment. A little bit anyway. There's not much to see there either, not even from a better angle here. One note is that the shot with the internal ribbing seems to be an early one. In both 2009 and 2016, that section is gone. On the other hand, we do get a good look at the scattered batteries, which are splitting apart where they landed on the bottom. In any event, that wraps up this portion. Let's look at a couple shots of the conning tower now. First, this one, which would seem to be from the first survey. The periscope is, after all, much more intact, and the tower itself is recognizable from the top. In 2009, on the other hand, that is much worse. Not only is the periscope gone, the rest of the tower has fallen apart. It's nowhere near as clean as it were. The top is hardly recognizable, and the side is falling apart. You can see a rusted out section here and a couple holes here. Those are still there in 2016, which is a good point to move to that survey. Starting with the excellent shot of the aft brake, which has surprisingly not changed that much. It's not as clear from further out, though even here you'll note there's not much extra rusting. When you move closer in, well, there's still not that much in the way of changes. The debris is still in the same spot, and the hull hasn't fallen apart much. Even the interior bulkhead and its wiring is much the same as it was in 2009. We can just see it better here, including some really close-in shots, as well as an angle showing the entire interior in a way we didn't have before. From head-on here, and from a bit lower down here, which seems to show a hole in the bulkhead better than the other images did, along with the relatively thin pressure hole around it, with a notable tear here. Although, moving further out, there's less to touch on. Again, it's pretty much the same, even down to the batteries on the bottom. So, let's move on to the side shots, starting with this one showing a jagged rust pattern. The actual side of the boat is also pretty much the same, aside from that hole towards the bow, which we'll touch on in a moment. First, we'll look at the aft end one more time, from a distance here, and close in on the batteries here to round it off. Now let's move to that hole. This has expanded a bit, particularly toward the top. Remember, damaged metal rusts faster, and this is a very apparent case of that, though that did create a large opening that could be explored. As I noted, a survey sent a camera inside in 2014. You couldn't have done that in 2009. In the NOAA survey, they got about as close as they could. That shows the exterior rusting pretty well, both of the hull overall and of the hull itself too. Perhaps more interesting, though, was the look inside. They had good enough lighting to make out some detail, specifically more of those batteries. Those really are scattered everywhere on this wreck. I'd imagine it's much the same inside the ward boats, but we don't have a look to say for sure. In any case, let's move on to the conning tower now, which is pretty much exactly the same as 2009, at least from what we can see. The rusted damage on the aft end is identical. The holes on the forward end don't seem to have opened up much, and the periscope stub is still there. While closer in looks do show the rusting in detail, it's debatable how much of that rust is really new. I'm not going to say it's pretty because it's not, but it remains interesting how little has really changed. Ward's boat is falling apart much, much faster. Regardless, the worst damage to the tower is on the aft end here, where a large portion has rusted away, and on the top here, where we see more of that rusted out steel. If any part is going to collapse in the near future, it's probably the aft end of the tower. It's holding on for dear life at this point. Even a bit further ahead of the periscope, more of that rusting is clear. It almost looks like the periscope mount has fallen in a bit. Actually, on the topic of that mount, we'll round off the conning tower here, with a look inside the stump. I can't think of another submarine wreck with a view quite like this, to be honest. That said, let's move on. We'll finish off the amidship section now with the bow end, where we have that gaping hole in the top, courtesy of the Navy salvage effort, which seems to have just been, who cares, punch a hole and stuff a chain in, leaving a large tear in the boat where the chain extends out. That hole has expanded a bit since 2009. Not a huge amount in common with the hole on the bow proper, but it is larger, and because of that, NOAA got another look inside the battery compartment. Granted, like the side shot, it's just more loose batteries. But you don't often see inside wrecks like this, so it's still worth noting, especially when they zoomed in. Moving on, however, we'll briefly touch on the forward end of that compartment. Once again, there's really not that much difference. It's a bit more blackened by rust, but that's about it. The chain hasn't moved, and the bulkhead is intact. While the footage is higher quality, I can't really point out much in the way of changes. Closer in, the rusting is admittedly more extensive, but it's more surface level damage than actual rusting through. Even the batteries are in the exact same position, clogging up the doorway. Although, in fairness, we do get a much better look at those batteries here. Beyond that, however, I would say the most interesting bit is actually here to the side, where the research lab team took their sample. In the years since, the hull has developed something of a rustical problem there. An excellent example of how even minor, non-invasive touching of a wreck can rapidly increase the rusting. If you're curious why NOAA, Nautilus, or Petrel were so careful, well, there you have it. At least this was an intentional test, not, say, submersibles ruining Titanic's deck. That aside, we've reached the end of the amidships section. Let's briefly move to the stern, which has the least material. mostly by virtue of being the smallest section with less noteworthy details. Not to say no details, just less. We'll start here from the forward end. As you can see, the extreme stern was neatly cut loose from the main hull. That's an interesting detail, I think, in light of the scuttling damage. As the NOAA survey noted, there's some 10 feet of the wreck that hasn't been located. This part was clearly cut loose from that section, not from the amidships portion where we have a part blown clean off. As for the stern section, well, it's draped in chain from the salvage. We see some of it here, behind the opening inside, which for its part shows a motor. We see that better from the front. Unfortunately, there's not much recognizable about it, on top of being buried by decades of silt and mud. It's not much better from higher up either. So back to the side we go, looking towards the aft end here. Very little damage is apparent on the stern from this angle, and the same applies from a slightly different one here. Just a faintly visible gash toward the prop. We'll see that better in 2016. For the moment, we'll move to the prop itself. Or so I'd say, but there's basically nothing left of it. The prop guard is a crumpled ruin, and the screw itself isn't recognizable at all. The Navy wrapped up the chain around this area, and it basically destroyed it. We see more of that chain in this haunting image from the stern facing forward. I know it's just a trick of the lighting, but it looks almost ghostly, and a good point to round off the 2009 look. Back to 2016 we go, where, as I've said multiple points, less change than you might expect. Take, for example, the prop guard and screw. Both are functionally identical to how they were in 2009. A bit more rusting, a bit more crumpling, but very little fundamental change. It remains as impressive here as it was on the bow or the amidships section, though we do, admittedly, get a better look at what remains of the screw, from far out here, and from very close in here. It's pretty unrecognizable, I'd say, but that's how it was in 2009 as well. However, as we move along the stern, we come to the single biggest change on the entire wreck, where the chain wraps around a large break in the hull. This was one of the thinnest points on the submarine, and it shows. That chain was wrapped up around it without a single care in the world, and it's led directly to this damage. The steel was weakened from being dragged along by that chain, and over the 7 years between the surveys, it gave way, leaving a jagged tear in the metal, though there's not much to see inside it. It really is the largest change, I think, between the two surveys. The rest of the stern section, on the other hand, shows less in the way of change. Much of the side ahead of the break is still largely the same. The chain hasn't even moved from where it was draped over it. The higher quality footage is nice, but there's not much to note. The interior, on the other hand, is much easier to make out. The motor, for instance, is more visible. We can more easily make out the shape of it from a distance, behind all that loose chain on the bottom. And when you move from the front, it's even easier to make out, though we can only really see part of the motor, of course. The rest is still hidden inside the hull. Even a closer-in look only really shows some equipment and the gearing better. There's some faint shapes further back here, but I can't make out anything in real detail. I'm sure someone will point it out in the comments. Either way, let's wrap up this longer than expected video. We'll move out from the motor to look at the other side of the wreck. There's still not much in the way of actual damage, of course. More of the chain is draped over it, hanging down from where it falls on the seabed. But the hull is mostly intact. Mostly. That break on the extreme aft end is still here. It's just not quite as impressive on this side. The hull is much smaller, though it will get larger as time goes by. As for the prop guard, well, it's about the same. So let's end things here, with a nice high-angle shot showing much of the stern section. A fitting place to end, I think, showing the last bit of the wreck in good detail. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.